May 20th, 1993, 2:15 p.m. Japanese-American National Museum, Los Angeles. In the sterile quiet of an archive room, a story that had been locked away for nearly 50 years began to spill into the magnetic tape of a Sony TCD 5M cassette recorder. Roy H. Matsumoto, an 80-year-old Nisei veteran whose posture was still as straight as it was in 1943, calmly recounted a secret that would rewrite a key chapter of the Pacific War. With the quiet hum of the recorder as his only audience, he detailed a tactic of such audacious simplicity and devastating effectiveness that military historians like Dr. James C. McNaughton would later spend years corroborating it, a ghost finally stepping out of the jungle fog of Leyte. To truly grasp the weight of Matsumoto's confession, you have to go back to the brutal autumn of 1944. The Battle of Leyte, which kicked off on October 20th, had bogged down into a horrific meat grinder. General Walter Kruger's 6th Army, with over 200,000 men, was being bled white by General Tomoyuki Yamashita's entrenched 35th Army. The real killers were the Japanese artillery pieces, specifically the Type 91 10-centimeters howitzers, dug into reverse-slope positions that made them invisible from the air. From these hidden nests, they rained hell on the American advance, inflicting hundreds of casualties a day. The air, thick with the metallic tang of cordite and the sweet, sickly smell of jungle decay, was a constant reminder that finding those guns wasn't just a priority, it was a matter of survival. This is where our unlikely team comes in. First, there was Sergeant Harold Harry Finch, a 28-year-old Signal Corps lineman from Zanesville, Ohio. A 7-year veteran of the Ohio Bell Telephone Company before being drafted in 1942, Finch's hands were a roadmap of calluses and old burns, and he possessed a quiet, methodical patience honed by tracing dead lines in Midwest blizzards. He was an expert with the EE-8 field telephone system, and had learned the hard way in New Guinea with Merrill's Marauders how the Japanese laid their communication wires. Paired with him was First Lieutenant David Cranston of the 136th Field Artillery Battalion, a 1941 Virginia Military Institute graduate. Cranston, with his wire-rimmed glasses perpetually perched on his nose and a slide rule always in his pocket, was the mathematical engine, the man who could turn a whispered coordinate into a precise storm of 105mm high-explosive shells. The problem they faced was concentrated on a godforsaken piece of mud called Hill 2225, part of the Breakneck Ridge system, around 4:30 hours on November 18, 1944. The American 37th Buckeye Division was stalled, pinned down by artillery they couldn't see. The mission, sanctioned directly by G2 Section Chief Major General Innes P. Swift, was absurdly dangerous. Find a way to pinpoint those guns. For Technical Sergeant Roy H. Matsumoto, a Kibé linguist who had volunteered from an internment camp in Arkansas, this meant sitting in a waterlogged listening post, the bone-chilling dampness seeping into his fatigues, waiting for a signal to come down a fragile strand of WD1/TT infantry wire. The secret wasn't a new radar or a code-breaking machine. It was something far more intimate and audacious. It relied on Sergeant Harold Finch's pre-war skills and Roy H. Matsumoto's flawless, native command of Japanese dialects. The plan required Finch to crawl up to 300 yards past American lines in total darkness, find an active enemy phone line, and perform a kind of battlefield surgery on it, with nothing more than a lineman's handset. Before I tell you how Technical Sergeant Roy Matsumoto and his small, clandestine team managed to turn the Japanese Army's own communication lines into a weapon against them, comment here where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of the Line Cross Intercept, a secret so devastating it remained buried for nearly 50 years. The brutal reality of the Leyte campaign had solidified by early November 1944. General Walter Kruger's massive 6th Army, numbering over 200,000 men, found itself caught in a tropical vice on an island just 134 miles long. The advance, which began with such confidence on October 20, 1944, had slowed to a bloody crawl against General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 35th Army. The air was a suffocating blanket of humidity, thick with the constant metallic smell of cordite from the relentless, unseen barrages of Japanese Type 91 10-centimeters howitzers that were chewing up American lives by the hundreds. The American tactical doctrine, honed in the jungles of New Guinea and Guadalcanal between 1942 and early 1944, was failing. The 37th Buckeye Division, under the command of Major General Robert S. Baitler, couldn't suppress what it couldn't see. The division's own powerful M2A 1,105 mm howitzers were firing blindly, their sound-ranging equipment rendered useless by the baffling acoustics of the mountains and the ceaseless roar of the monsoon. By November 10, 1944, the G2 Intelligence Section, led by a frustrated Major General Innes P. Swift, was staring at casualty reports that exceeded 500 men per week for the division, with no viable solution in sight. The constant rain had turned the entire front into a quagmire of reddish-brown mud, a physical manifestation of their strategic stagnation. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, a brilliant and ruthless tactician known as the quote of Malaya, had prepared his defenses with meticulous care. He had organized his 45,000 troops into a defense-in-depth system, the infamous Yamashita Line, that leveraged Leyte's treacherous terrain. His artillerymen from the 1st Field Artillery Regiment were masters of reverse slope defense, a tactic they had perfected in the Second Sino-Japanese War after 1937. Their Type 91 10-centimeters howitzers and smaller Type 41 75 mm mountain guns, with ranges exceeding 10,000 meters, were dug into camouflaged pits reinforced with coconut logs and volcanic earth. These positions were functionally invisible to the P-47 Thunderbolt pilots of General George Kenney's 5th Air Force, who could see nothing but an unbroken sea of green jungle canopy during their reconnaissance flights on November 12th and 14th. For the GIs on the ground, the only warning was a terrifying, high-pitched whistle, followed by a ground-shaking explosion. The human cost of this stalemate was staggering. The 129th and 148th Infantry Regiments, tasked with taking the key defensive network known as Breakneck Ridge, were being systematically dismantled. Between November 8th and November 15th, 1944, those two regiments alone suffered over 620 casualties, many of them grievously wounded by shrapnel. The aid stations, little more than muddy tents smelling of antiseptic and blood, were overwhelmed. The morale of the men, already strained by weeks of fighting in appalling conditions, was beginning to fray under the psychological weight of being attacked by an enemy they couldn't even locate. Major General Baitler's pleas for a solution grew more urgent with each passing day. The standard intelligence gathering methods were a complete wash. Aerial photography on November 16, 1944, yielded nothing. The experimental ANTPQ-1 counter-battery radar, a new piece of technology rushed to the Pacific, proved wholly ineffective against the deeply entrenched Japanese guns. Even the normally reliable intelligence gleaned from captured soldiers was sparse. The men of Yamashita's 35th Army fought with a fanatical devotion, rarely allowing themselves to be taken alive. By the morning of November 17th, General Kruger knew that if Breakneck Ridge didn't fall soon, the entire Ormoc Valley campaign could stall indefinitely. The Japanese command, meanwhile, operated with a sense of supreme confidence in their communications security. Their entire command and control network relied on the robust Type 92 field telephone, WWII, its signals carried by a single-strand, black, rubber-insulated copper wire. Officers like Colonel Satoshi Oi of the 1st Division, trained at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, followed telephone protocols with religious precision. They held a deep-seated cultural belief, shared by Lieutenant General Jiro Harada commanding the ground forces, that the Japanese language itself with its intricate honorifics and vast array of regional dialects, was a virtually unbreakable code. The possibility that an American could master it well enough to fool a native speaker was considered laughable, a catastrophic failure of imagination that would have devastating consequences. This is where Sergeant Harold Harry Finch entered the picture. At 28 years old, the quiet lineman from Zanesville, Ohio, was a master of his craft, not a soldier by nature. His 7 years with the Ohio Bell Telephone Company, before being drafted in 1942, were spent climbing poles in Midwestern blizzards, his calloused hands able to diagnose a dead line by feel alone. He carried his standard-issue lineman's kit, a TS-10 test handset, and a pair of TL-13A wire cutters, with the reverence of a surgeon. He had a sixth sense for electricity, for the subtle hum of a live wire that others couldn't hear. Finch's experience wasn't just civilian. His harrowing tour with Merrill's Marauders in Burma from February to May of 1944 had been a brutal education in jungle warfare and, specifically, Japanese signal corps tactics. He'd seen firsthand how the 5,307th Composite Unit was hounded by their artillery, and he'd made it his business to study how they laid their communication wires, often hastily, prioritizing speed over concealment, and almost always within a few hundred yards of a main trail. A methodical man who chewed on unlit cigars to ward off insects, Finch wasn't driven by patriotism in the abstract. He was driven by the concrete memory of his friends being torn apart by mortars they never saw coming. He saw every Japanese phone line not as a wire, but as a nerve leading straight to the enemy's brain. The other half of this improbable equation was Technical Sergeant Roy H. Matsumoto. Born in Los Angeles in 1913, he was a Kibei, a U.S. citizen educated in Japan. He had attended high school in Hiroshima, giving him a flawless, native command of the language that no stateside language school could ever replicate. He understood the subtle linguistic cues that distinguished an officer from an enlisted man, the regional accent of a soldier from Kyushu versus one from Hokkaido. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, he and his family were unjustly incarcerated at the Jerome War Relocation Center in Arkansas under Executive Order 9066. From behind that barbed wire, he volunteered for the U.S. Army, graduating from the highly classified Military Intelligence Service Language School at Camp Savage, Minnesota, in 1943. He was more than a translator. He was a cultural chameleon, a living skeleton key to the Japanese military mind. For Matsumoto, this fight was deeply personal. He wore the uniform of a country that had imprisoned his family, a psychological burden he bore with quiet dignity. He was fighting not only the Imperial Japanese Army, but also the pervasive suspicion that shadowed every Nisei soldier. Tucked inside his helmet liner was a worn photograph of his wife and daughter, a constant, tangible reminder of his purpose. Every intercepted Japanese order that saved an American life was a defiant answer to those who questioned his loyalty. His mission on Leyte wasn't just a military objective. It was a profound act of validation. And then there was the final piece, First Lieutenant David Cranston of the 136th Field Artillery Battalion. A 1941 graduate of the Virginia Military Institute with a degree in civil engineering, Cranston was the personification of order amidst the jungle's chaos. From his muddy forward observation post, which smelled perpetually of damp canvas and stale coffee, he operated with cold, mathematical precision. His world revolved around his M1 plotting board, his slide rule, and the complex firing tables for the M2A 1,105 mm howitzers. He was the man who had to turn whispers of intelligence into a precise, devastating storm of steel. By mid-November 1944, however, the intelligence had dried up, and his guns were falling silent more often than not, a frustrating reality for a man who believed every problem had a numerical solution. The American field communications technology was centered on the EE-8 field telephone, a rugged 11-pound unit in a leather case, powered by two BA-30 batteries. It connected via spools of WD-1 infantry wire, a durable twisted pair cable designed to withstand the rigors of combat. Standard U.S. Army doctrine, as laid out in Field Manual FM 24-5 from 1942, included procedures for wiretapping, but these were crude, brute force methods that involved cutting into a line and were easily detected by any competent signalman checking for changes in line resistance. The plan coalescing in the minds of G2 staff wasn't in any manual. It was a desperate, field-expedient gamble to combine Finch's physical skills with Matsumoto's unique linguistic talents, creating something entirely new. The crucible for this experiment was to be Breakneck Ridge. By the evening of November 17, 1944, the monsoon had been hammering the island for 3 straight days. The world was reduced to shades of green and brown, a landscape of mud, slick rock, and dripping vegetation. The sound was a maddening symphony, the incessant drumming of rain on helmets and ponchos, the high-pitched whine of malarial mosquitoes, the distant, hollow crump of Japanese artillery, and the sudden, terrifyingly close chatter of a Type 99 machine gun. It was an environment that stripped away the veneer of modern warfare, leaving only mud, steel, and human will. The order, when it came, was delivered verbally. On the evening of November 17th, Major General Innes P. Swift personally briefed Finch, Matsumoto, and Cranston. The operation was given the deliberately innocuous designation, Special Field Method 7. There would be no paper trail. Swift, a stern West Pointer who smelled of cigar smoke and the immense pressure of command, looked each man in the eye. He made it clear that they would be operating completely on their own, far ahead of friendly lines. If they were captured or killed, the U.S. Army would disavow any knowledge of their mission. They were to become ghosts. And so, in the pre-dawn darkness of November 18, 1944, as a chilling mist settled over the forward slopes of Hill 2225, the components of this audacious plan were set. Sergeant Finch, the Ohio Bell lineman, checked his TS-10 handset and coiled 300 yards of thin WD-1/TT wire around his chest. Lieutenant Cranston, the VMI-trained engineer, rechecked the calibration on his plotting board, waiting for coordinates from a source that didn't yet exist. And in a hastily dug listening post, smelling of wet earth and nervous sweat, Technical Sergeant Roy Matsumoto plugged his headset into an EE-8B field phone. He was listening for more than just conversation. He was listening for the precise vocal tics and formal grammar of an officer from the 1st Field Artillery Regiment, a voice he was preparing to steal. The genesis of Special Field Method 7 wasn't cooked up in some high-tech lab back at Fort Monmouth. It was born from the bitter, mud-caked memories of Sergeant Harold Finch. During his brutal tour with Merrill's Marauders in Burma from February to May of 1944, he'd spent countless hours studying the hasty, almost sloppy way the Japanese Signal Corps laid their single-strand communication wire. He confided in Major General Innes P. Swift on November 17th that he could tap it without cutting it, a technique he'd perfected repairing storm-damaged lines for Ohio Bell Telephone Company back in '39. It was a ghost of an idea, a lineman's trick brought to a war zone, but it was exactly the kind of unconventional method that General Walter Kruger had authorized G2 to explore just 2 days prior. The equipment list was deceptively simple, a testament to Finch's field-expedient genius. He laid out his kit for Lieutenant David Cranston, the VMI-trained engineer, in the dim light of a kerosene lamp that smelled of soot and wet canvas. It consisted of a standard-issue 11-pound EE-8B field telephone, his personal TS-10 lineman's handset, a pair of TL-1 3A wire cutters, and the crucial component, 2 insulated alligator clips he'd scavenged from a wrecked radio set in Hollandia. Finch explained that by creating a parallel circuit, the tap would draw less than 0.05 milliamps of current from the Japanese Type 92 field phone line, an amount so minuscule it wouldn't create a detectable change in line resistance. The whole setup, including 300 yards of WD-1 TT wire, weighed less than 15 pounds, light enough to carry deep into the jungle's embrace. But Finch's clever wiring was only the delivery system. The real weapon was the voice of Technical Sergeant Roy H. Matsumoto. His training at the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Camp Savage, Minnesota, under the legendary Major John F. Aso, had gone far beyond simple translation. It was a masterclass in psychological and linguistic infiltration. For over a year, from 1943 to 1944, Matsumoto had spent more than 1,000 hours listening to captured radio traffic and interrogations, meticulously deconstructing the speech patterns of Imperial Japanese Army officers. He could perfectly replicate the subtle arrogance in the voice of a graduate from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, the specific regional accent of a soldier from Kyushu, and the precise, formal honorifics required when addressing a superior. He didn't just speak Japanese, he could become a Japanese officer, a skill that was about to be tested in the most extreme way imaginable. Their final rehearsal took place behind American lines on the night of November 17, 1944, around 2200 hours. Finch had strung a captured 50-meter section of Japanese black rubber-insulated wire between two dripping abaca plants. As Lieutenant Cranston watched, his wire-rimmed glasses fogging in the humid air, Finch's calloused hands moved with an almost balletic grace in the near-total darkness. With a razor-sharp knife, he shaved a tiny 3-millimeter sliver of insulation off the wire, attached the alligator clips, and handed the TS-10 handset to Matsumoto. The whole process, from start to finish, took him 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Through the earpiece, Matsumoto could hear the faint, clear static of an open line. It worked. The truly audacious leap, however, came from Matsumoto himself. The initial plan formulated by G2 and Finch was purely passive: listen, translate, and report. But as they finalized the details in their muddy dugout, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke, Matsumoto proposed the unthinkable. He argued to a stunned Finch and Cranston that after proving the intelligence was good, he should break into the line. He could impersonate a Japanese forward observer, report false American troop movements to draw their fire, or, most devastatingly, call in a fire mission from a Japanese artillery battery asterisk on its own position. It was a move that transformed the operation from intelligence gathering into active psychological warfare. To make this possible, Finch performed a delicate piece of battlefield surgery on his TS-10 handset. Using a small soldering iron heated over a can of sterno, which filled their cramped listening post with the acrid smell of burning rosin, he bypassed the handset's standard push-to-talk switch. The modification, which took him less than 20 minutes, created a direct, always-open voice circuit. He explained to Matsumoto that this would allow him to inject his voice onto the Japanese line without the telltale click of an American-made switch, a sound that any competent Japanese signalman, like those trained by Captain Kiyoshi Nakayama of the 1st Division Signal Unit, would instantly recognize as anomalous. The security measures were absolute and terrifyingly simple. Major General Innes P. Swift had been explicit. Special Field Method 7 existed only in their 3 minds and his. It was a verbal order, with no paper trail. Their communication back to the 136th Field Artillery Battalion's Fire Directions Center would be through a completely separate, dedicated WD-1 TT line that Finch himself would lay and retrieve. In the official artillery logs maintained by the battalion clerk, every set of coordinates provided by Matsumoto would be attributed to G2 visual reconnaissance, a plausible, untraceable lie. Under the 1907 Hague Convention, if captured, they wouldn't be prisoners of war, they'd be spies, subject to summary execution. The final piece of this deadly puzzle was the cold, mathematical precision of First Lieutenant David Cranston. While Finch and Matsumoto prepared their gear, Cranston was hunched over his M1 plotting board, the canvas of his command post slick with condensation. To minimize response time, He spent over 6 hours on November 17th pre-calculating firing solutions for a grid of 20 high-probability target zones across Breakneck Ridge, each covering 500 square meters. This meant when Matsumoto whispered a coordinate, Cranston wouldn't be starting his complex trigonometry from scratch. He could adjust a pre-plotted solution, cutting the time from target identification to the first M2A 1105 mm shell, leaving the tube from a standard 3 minutes to a shocking 45 seconds. His obsession with preparation was a hallmark of his VMI education under Colonel George A. Moore, who preached that, quote, speed is security. Cranston, a man who habitually checked his slide rule's alignment 3 times before any calculation, knew that a 2-minute delay could mean the difference between destroying a Japanese howitzer and having it fire another 10 rounds into the 129th Infantry's position. His plotting board, covered in a spiderweb of grease pencil markings, was a physical manifestation of this deadly race against time. The weight of hundreds of lives rested on his ability to turn a whispered Japanese phrase into a perfectly calculated storm of American steel, a burden that showed in the perpetual tension around his eyes. By 4 o'clock hours on November 18, 1944, as the monsoon rain finally subsided to a miserable drizzle, the secret was complete. It wasn't a bomb or a new type of radar. It was a weaponized synergy of 3 men's unique skills, forged in the mud of Leyte. It was a lineman's hands, a linguist's voice, and an artilleryman's mind. Sergeant Harold Finch, his face darkened with camouflage paint that smelled of grease and earth, slung the 300-yard coil of wire over his shoulder. He gave a single, curt nod to Matsumoto in the darkness. The ghost was ready to go to work. At 6:15 hours on November 18, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army's 1st Field Artillery Regiment watched in stunned disbelief as his 3rd Battery, a nest of 3 Type 91 10 centimeters, howitzers dug perfectly into a reverse slope, simply vanished in a series of colossal, earth-shattering explosions. The American barrage was too fast, too precise. He felt the percussive blast over 800 meters away, the air suddenly tasting of scorched metal and pulverized rock. In his command bunker, the bakelite receiver of his Type 92 field telephone felt slick with sweat as he frantically tried to raise a battery that no longer existed. The immediate conclusion reached by a furious Colonel Satoshi Oe, Tanaka's superior, was a catastrophic error by their own forward observer, Lieutenant Kenji Sato. The second theory was a lucky shot from the American 136th Field Artillery Battalion. Sabotage was never considered. Captain Kiyoshi Nakayama, the regimental signal officer, personally led a 2-man team to inspect the 200 meters of communication wire leading to the now silent battery. He ran his fingers over every inch of the black rubber insulation, his sensitive ohmmeter showing no unexpected resistance drops, no splices, no cuts. The line was pristine. The cause of the disaster, he reported to Colonel O at 11 o'clock hours, was not a failure of communications security. This profound failure of imagination was rooted in a deep-seated cultural and procedural arrogance. Colonel Satoshi Oe and Lieutenant General Jiro Harada, both distinguished graduates of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, held the unshakable belief that the Japanese language itself was a fortress. The idea that any foreigner, let alone a Nisei whom they viewed as a dishonorable traitor, could master the intricate web of honorifics, asterisk, keigo asterisk, regional dialects, and specific military protocols, was simply inconceivable. Just 2 days prior, on November 16th, they had monitored an American propaganda broadcast in clumsy textbook Japanese and laughed at its amateurishness. The possibility of a ghost in their own wire wasn't just unlikely, it was an ontological impossibility. Back in the American listening post, the routine was becoming brutally methodical. Sergeant Harold Finch, his lean frame having shed 15 pounds since landing on Leyte, would return just before sunrise, his face a mask of mud and grease paint that smelled of damp earth. Before sleeping, he'd meticulously clean his TL-13A wire cutters with a small, oil-soaked rag, a ritualistic habit he'd developed over 7 years of repairing storm-damaged lines for the Ohio Bell Telephone Company. It was this pre-war discipline, this respect for the tools, that made his work in the jungle so flawless and invisible. Inside the two-man hole, which perpetually smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat, Technical Sergeant Roy Matsumoto was giving the performance of his life. For 2 days, he'd done nothing but listen, absorbing the cadence and verbal tics of the Japanese officers on the line. He learned that Captain Ito of the 2nd Battery had a slight cough and always said, "Yoshi, all right," before confirming a fire mission. On the afternoon of November 20th, at approximately 14:30 hours, Matsumoto broke in. Perfectly mimicking Ito's voice, he calmly corrected the coordinates for a planned barrage on the 129th Infantry, shifting the impact zone 800 meters east into an empty, mosquito-infested swamp. The deception was perfect. The resulting confusion rippled through the Japanese command structure. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, a radiotelegrapher with the 35th Army Signal Unit, logged the strange correction order, noting it didn't follow the standard 2-step verification protocol. He reported the anomaly to his superior, Lieutenant Isao Honda, a career officer who had been trained in the signal doctrines of the 1930s. Honda, overwhelmed by the chaos of the Breakneck Ridge fight, dismissed the concern as a minor procedural lapse, common in the heat of battle. The landline, a physical, tangible connection, was considered inviolable. His focus remained on the coded messages coming through his Type 94 radio set, never suspecting the real threat was whispering down a simple copper wire. For First Lieutenant David Cranston, the results were anything but confusing. The VMI-trained engineer, hunched over his M1 plotting board, his wire-rimmed glasses perpetually fogging in the humidity, was receiving a stream of impossibly perfect intelligence. On November 21st, at 9:40 hours, Matsumoto whispered the coordinates of a Japanese command post where a major counterattack was being planned. Cranston's 136th Field Artillery Battalion unleashed 32 rounds of M1 high-explosive shells from their M2A 1,105 mm howitzers. The secondary explosions, a chain reaction of detonating ammunition, confirmed a direct hit. The entire engagement, from intercept to enemy neutralized, took a breathtaking 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The physical manifestation of this success was felt by men like Major Kenjiro Nomura of the 1st Division. A hardened veteran of the campaigns in Manchuria, Nomura was assembling his 2nd Battalion for a night assault on November 22nd. At 2100 hours, his promised artillery support was abruptly canceled by an order relayed through a sister unit. Minutes later, a terrifyingly accurate American barrage walked directly through his assembly area. Nomura survived, thrown into a muddy crater by a blast that killed 47 of his men. In his after-action report, he furiously blamed gross incompetence and communication failures at regimental headquarters, inadvertently reinforcing the very narrative that kept the American secret safe. The operational tempo was taking a severe physical and psychological toll on the 3-man American team. Finch, already gaunt, was plagued by jungle sores and subsisted entirely on cold K rations. Matsumoto, wearing his headset for up to 18 hours a day, suffered from splitting headaches and a constant ringing in his ears. The faint hiss of the open line, a phantom sound that followed him into his brief, fitful sleep. His only anchor to sanity was a worn, celluloid-protected photograph of his wife and daughter in the Jerome internment camp, which he would stare at in the dim light before every dangerous transmission. He wasn't just fighting for the U.S. Army, he was fighting for their future. The Japanese High Command, desperate for an explanation, redoubled their efforts to find the source of the intelligence leak. On November 24th, First Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of their most experienced reconnaissance pilots from the 4th Air Army, flew his Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar in a series of low passes over the 37th Division sector. His report to Colonel Satoshi Oe was baffling. He saw no new American observation posts, no telltale glint of optics, nothing to explain the almost supernatural prescience of their artillery. Convinced he had a high-level traitor in his staff, Oe requested an investigation by the dreaded Kempitai military police. This wave of internal paranoia crippled his command structure far more effectively than any American bomb, as officers became afraid to communicate openly for fear of being accused of espionage. Between November 18th and December 2nd, the team operated with a relentless, exhausting efficiency. Matsumoto's intelligence pinpointed the exact locations of 7 IJA artillery command posts and 18 separate gun emplacements belonging to the 1st Field Artillery Regiment. To avoid detection, Finch had to move his physical tap 3 times, each operation a heart-stopping, hours-long crawl through no man's land. During one such mission on the night of November 26th, he lay frozen in the mud as a Japanese patrol passed less than 20 feet away, the sweet, cloying smell of their clove cigarettes hanging heavy in the damp night air. He held his breath for what felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the frantic pounding of his own heart. The results were statistically devastating and strategically decisive. Post-battle analysis confirmed the destruction of at least 11 Type 91 10cm howitzers and 5 Type 41 75mm mountain guns, directly attributable to the team's intelligence. The official after-action report of the 136th Field Artillery Battalion, declassified in 1978, noted a staggering 70% increase in counter-battery effectiveness during this exact 2-week period, attributing the success to a vague and untraceable source: uncorroborated G2 special intelligence. The secret remained buried under a mountain of bureaucratic paperwork. Confronted with losses they couldn't explain, the Japanese command made a fatal strategic error based on a completely false premise. On November 28th, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, believing the Americans had deployed a revolutionary new sound-ranging or flash-spotting technology, issued a new standing order to all artillery units in the 35th Army. They were to drastically reduce their rate of fire and, critically, to relocate their guns after every 3rd fire mission. This doctrine, born of total ignorance, effectively crippled their own artillery, ceding fire superiority across the entire front to General Walter Kruger's forces. For the exhausted GIs of the 129th and 148th Infantry Regiments, the change was almost miraculous. The constant, nerve-shredding whistle of incoming Japanese shells, a sound that had haunted their days and nights for weeks, began to fade. The air, once thick with the metallic tang of cordite, started to smell of rain and wet earth again. On December 1st, 1944, they finally secured the last bloody knoll of Breakneck Ridge. They credited their own incredible courage and the overwhelming power of their artillery, never knowing that the real victory was won by a quiet man whispering into a telephone in a muddy hole. And as the battle for the ridge reached its climax, the secret remained perfectly preserved. After his final mission in the sector, Sergeant Harold Finch crawled back one last time. In the pre-dawn gloom, his calloused fingers found the 2 alligator clips and gently removed them. He smoothed over the tiny 3mm incision in the rubber insulation, leaving a mark indistinguishable from any other nick or scrape from being dragged through the jungle. The ghost had erased its footprints. Miles away, in a sandbagged bunker, Captain Kiyoshi Nakayama delivered his morning report. All landline communications remained, as they had always been, 100% secure. The victory at Breakneck Ridge didn't earn the team a parade, it earned them a target. By January 9, 1945, as 175,000 men of General Walter Kruger's 6th Army stormed ashore at Lingayen Gulf on Luzon, Special Field Method 7 was no longer an experiment. It was a core, albeit secret, asset. Major General Innes P. Swift, now fully aware of the weapon he possessed, attached Finch and Matsumoto directly to the G2 section of the 32nd Red Arrow Division, commanded by Major General William H. Gill. Their new objective: dismantle the formidable defenses of General Tomoyuki Yamashita's Shobu Group, dug into the 20-mile-long Villa Verde Trail. The Luzon campaign demanded an evolution of the tactic. The terrain was different, drier, dustier, with rocky ravines instead of Leyte's perpetual mud. Sergeant Harold Finch, his face now permanently etched with exhaustion, adapted his methods. He started using a lighter, more durable WD-1 ATT infantry wire and modified his TS-10 handset with a two-stage amplifier scavenged from a damaged AN/PRC-6 radio, allowing him to tap lines from over 450 yards away. This increased his safety margin, but also the physical strain. Each mission was a 6-hour, muscle-burning crawl. First Lieutenant David Cranston, reassigned to the 129th Field Artillery Battalion, had by now memorized Matsumoto's vocal cadence, allowing him to verify coordinates with a simple two-word challenge and response code, a security layer they developed on the transport ship between December 26 and January 4, 1945. Their first major test on Luzon came on February 28, 1945, near the town of Santa Maria. The 127th Infantry Regiment was pinned down by a cluster of Type 41 75mm mountain guns, commanded by a stubborn Major Goro Takada. For 48 hours, Technical Sergeant Roy Matsumoto listened to Takada's frantic commands, the smell of stale air in his dugout a constant companion. He noted Takada's habit of clearing his throat before issuing a fire order. At 3 o'clock hours on March 1st, Matsumoto broke in, perfectly mimicking the voice of a subordinate artillery spotter, Lieutenant Kenji Eda. He reported a major American armor column massing at a false coordinate. When Takada ordered all 4 of his guns to reorient and fire, their muzzle flashes gave away their positions. Cranston's pre-plotted response was instantaneous. 24 rounds of 105mm shells obliterated the entire battery in less than 90 seconds. The psychological cost of this deception was mounting, especially for Matsumoto. He wasn't just translating words anymore. He was inhabiting the minds of men he was sending to their deaths. After the Santa Maria mission, Finch found him sitting in the dark, the headset still on but unplugged, just staring at the worn photograph of his wife and daughter. He was a ghost in the wire, but the ghosts were starting to follow him back. The constant strain manifested in a nervous tic in his left eye, and a diet that consisted of little more than coffee and cigarettes, the acrid smoke a constant fog in their listening post. He had saved over 100 American lives that night, but he had done so by becoming Major Goro Takada's executioner. Meanwhile, the Japanese High Command was descending into a state of paranoid chaos. General Shizuo Yokoyama, commanding the Shimbu Group defending Manila, was convinced he had a high-level leak. On March 5, 1945, he authorized the *Kempeitai, led by the notoriously brutal Colonel Shichi Ota, to conduct a full-scale counterintelligence sweep. Ota's men arrested and tortured over 15 Japanese signal officers, including Captain Hideo Tanaka, for communication security failures. The witch hunt completely disrupted their command and control, forcing officers to rely on slow, unreliable foot messengers for critical orders. Unbeknownst to them, their search for a traitor was crippling their own war effort far more effectively than any American bomb. The strategic value of Special Field Method 7 was now undeniable, even to those who didn't know it existed. The intelligence provided by Matsumoto was laundered through G2 channels, and presented to General Kruger's planners as originating from long-range reconnaissance patrols. This ghost intelligence directly influenced the battle for the Villa Verde Trail. Between March 10 and April 2, 1945, Matsumoto's intercepts preempted 2 major Japanese counterattacks by the 2nd Tank Division, saving the 126th Infantry Regiment from a potential disaster and preserving at least 30 of their precious M4 Sherman tanks. The trail, which military planners had estimated would take 8 weeks to secure, fell in just over 5. The team's luck almost ran out on the night of April 12, 1945. Sergeant Harold Finch, crawling through a bamboo thicket to tap a line near Salaksak Pass, felt the ground vibrate. A two-man Japanese patrol, their hobnailed boots crunching on the dry leaves, stopped less than 10 feet from his position. Finch lay perfectly still for 17 agonizing minutes, his face pressed into the dirt, the smell of damp earth and his own cold sweat filling his nostrils. One of the soldiers lit a cigarette, the flare of the match briefly illuminating Finch's camouflaged hand clutching his TL-13A wire cutters. The patrol moved on, oblivious. The incident forced Finch to develop a new protocol. He would only tap lines during the peak noise of an artillery barrage, using the thunder of American guns to mask his own movements. The secrecy surrounding the unit was absolute. Major General Innes P. Swift had personally classified all reports related to their activities as top secret Zebra, a designation reserved for the most sensitive intelligence operations, including the magic code-breaking decrypts. Only 4 men in the entire Pacific Theater knew the full truth: Swift, Finch, Matsumoto, and Cranston. When a curious regimental S2 officer from the 128th Infantry, Captain John Miller, began asking questions about the uncanny accuracy of their counter-battery fire in mid-April, he was quietly transferred to a rear echelon posting in New Guinea within 24 hours by an order originating directly from Swift's office. The cumulative impact of the ghost in the wire was staggering. By the time the battle for Luzon was declared officially over on June 30, 1945, the team had been operational for over 7 months. Conservative estimates by Dr. James C. McNaughton, cross-referencing artillery logs with Matsumoto's later testimony, credit the team with the direct destruction of over 34 Japanese artillery pieces, 12 command posts, and 2 ammunition dumps. This intelligence is estimated to have saved the lives of nearly 650 American soldiers and shortened the brutal Luzon campaign by at least 4 weeks, a direct saving of thousands of casualties and millions of dollars in material. Their final and perhaps most devastating act came on May 20, 1945, during the fight for the Balep Pass. Matsumoto intercepted a desperate, last-ditch order from Colonel Matsunaga Takeo of the 10th Division to consolidate his remaining 600 men for a banzai charge. Posing as a staff officer from General Yamashita's headquarters, Matsumoto calmly countermanded the order, redirecting Takeo's entire force to a more strategic defensive position in a narrow, exposed canyon. Minutes later, Lieutenant David Cranston's 129th Field Artillery Battalion, along with 2 other battalions, fired a TOT, time-on-target mission, involving over 300 rounds of 105 mm and 155 mm high-explosive shells into that exact canyon. The attack was broken before it ever began. For nearly 30 years, the ghost remains silent, a secret buried under mountains of classified paperwork, and the quiet stoicism of the men who kept it. The first crack in the silence came not with a bang, but with the dry rustle of paper. In 1974, under a general declassification order from President Gerald Ford, thousands of 6th Army G2 after-action reports were moved from secure vaults to the National Archives. Among them, File G237AAR, a 120-page document bound in faded red cardboard, contained a cryptic footnote by Major General Innes P. Swift mentioning, quote, uncorroborated G2 special intelligence as the source for a 70% spike in counter-battery effectiveness on Leyte. But a footnote wasn't a story. The truth wouldn't be pried from dusty files. It had to be given freely. The real key turned on May 20, 1993, at 2:15 p.m., in the sterile, climate-controlled archive room of the Japanese-American National Museum in Los Angeles. Dr. Eric Saul, the museum's founder, sat across from Roy H. Matsumoto, now 80 years old, his posture still ramrod straight. As the magnetic tape of a Sony TCD-5M cassette recorder spun with a soft, hypnotic hum, Matsumoto began to speak, his voice calm and measured. He didn't just recount a war story, he confessed to a secret, detailing the step-by-step process of the line cross intercept, with a clarity that made the air in the room feel heavy with the weight of unspoken history. The immediate impact of Matsumoto's testimony was a quiet shockwave through a small circle of military historians. Dr. James C. McNaughton, then a lead historian for the U.S. Army Center of Military History, received a transcript of the 3-hour interview in late 1993. He recalled reading it in his Arlington, Virginia office, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, feeling a growing sense of disbelief and then profound excitement. He knew the official histories of Leyte and Luzon, written by men like Dr. Stanley L. Falk, had always contained unexplained gaps, Japanese command structures that suddenly collapsed, artillery that inexplicably fell silent. Matsumoto's account was the missing piece, the ghost in the machine. McNaughton and his small team of 2 research assistants began a painstaking 2-year process of corroboration that felt like an archaeological dig. They cross-referenced Matsumoto's specific dates with the recently declassified artillery logs of the 136th and 129th Field Artillery Battalions, stored on microfiche at the U.S. Army Military History Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. They found it, a perfect 1-to-1 correlation. On November 21, 1944, a day Matsumoto claimed to have identified a command post, the 136th log showed an unscheduled fire mission on those exact coordinates, attributed to, quote, 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 WWII going, quote, 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 quote. The exact cover story, devised by Major General Innes P. Swift. The dry, bureaucratic language of the logs suddenly came alive, screaming confirmation of Matsumoto's incredible tale. The smell of old paper and microfilm developer fluid in the archives was the smell of history being rewritten. The next step for Dr. McNaughton was tracking down the other 2 men. First Lieutenant David Cranston had passed away from a heart attack in 1988, a quiet civil engineer in Richmond, Virginia, who had never once spoken of the operation to his family. But Sergeant Harold Harry Finch was alive, living a quiet life of retirement in Zanesville, Ohio. When McNaughton's research assistant, a young historian named Mark Harrison, called him in the spring of 1995, Finch was initially silent. Then, after a long pause, the 79-year-old former lineman, his voice raspy from a lifetime of chewing unlit cigars, simply said, "I was wondering if anyone would ever ask." His subsequent 4-hour interview provided the final, crucial technical details, from the scavenged alligator clips to the modified TS-10 handset, validating every aspect of Matsumoto's story. This confirmed evidence fundamentally shattered the long-held narrative of the Pacific War. Historians like Dr. Stanley L. Falk had previously attributed the victory on Breakneck Ridge to sheer American grit and industrial might. Now, a new, more nuanced picture emerged, one of sophisticated, asymmetric warfare, where the linguistic skill of one man and the technical expertise of another were as decisive as a 1,000-pound bomb. The collapse of Japanese defenses wasn't just attrition, it was a targeted decapitation of their nervous system, performed by a ghost they never knew existed. The revelation sent ripples through the Nisei veteran community. For 50 years, these men of the Military Intelligence Service had served in the shadows, their contributions largely unknown and unheralded. Matsumoto's story became a powerful symbol of their silent, vital role. At a 1996 reunion of MIS veterans in Honolulu, Hawaii, a fellow linguist, Kazuo Yamane, who had served on Guadalcanal, stood up and said, "Roy did what we all dreamed of doing. He didn't just listen to the enemy, he became the enemy." For these men, it was a profound, long-overdue validation. The U.S. Army itself had to officially reckon with a piece of its own hidden history. In 1997, based on the overwhelming evidence compiled by Dr. McNaughton, Roy H. Matsumoto was inducted into the U.S. Army Rangers Hall of Fame, not for a single act of bravery, but for a sustained, strategic intelligence operation of unparalleled success. The citation, read aloud at Fort Benning, Georgia, specifically mentioned his innovative and daring methods of intelligence gathering. The bureaucracy that had buried the secret for 50 years was now the very instrument of its official recognition. The story finally broke into the public consciousness with the publication of Dr. James C. McNaughton's definitive book, Nisei Linguists, Japanese Americans in the Military Intelligence Service during World War II, in 2006. The 543-page volume, published by the U.S. Army, dedicated an entire chapter to Special Field Method-7. It laid out the evidence in meticulous detail, transforming what was once a veteran's quiet confession into an undeniable, documented part of American military history. It became required reading at intelligence schools like Fort Huachuca, a formal acknowledgement of a lesson learned in the mud of Leyte. This new understanding changed everything. It explained the baffling, quote, friendly fire incidents in Japanese after-action reports, the sudden paralysis of their command structure, and the almost supernatural accuracy of American artillery at critical moments. The victory in the Philippines was no longer just a story of overwhelming force. It was now also the story of a quiet lineman from Ohio, a brilliant linguist from an internment camp, and an artilleryman from Virginia, a trio who fought and won a secret war inside the enemy's own head, their voices echoing down a captured wire. The official recognition, when it finally came, wasn't a single thunderclap, but a slow, rolling tide of overdue honor. On June 5, 2000, President Bill Clinton awarded the entire Military Intelligence Service, including over 6,000 Nisei soldiers, a Presidential Unit citation for their extraordinary contributions. For Roy H. Matsumoto, who had already been inducted into the U.S. Army Ranger Hall of Fame in 1997, it was a collective vindication. A quieter, but no less significant ceremony took place in Zanesville, Ohio, where Harold Harry Finch, who passed away in 2001, was honored by the Ohio Bell Telephone Company with a permanent plaque in their main switching center. The plaque, bearing the image of a TS-10 handset, commemorated the lineman whose pre-war skills saved hundreds of lives over 7,000 miles from home, a testament to a different kind of soldier. The historical record was irrevocably altered. Textbooks written by esteemed historians, like Dr. Stanley L. Falk, which had long attributed the American success on Leyte to overwhelming firepower and attrition, were suddenly incomplete. The revelation of Special Field Method-7 forced a fundamental reevaluation, introducing the critical role of asymmetric warfare and human intelligence. The sudden, inexplicable collapse of Japanese command and control at Breakneck Ridge was no longer a mystery. It was the direct result of a ghost in their own wire. This new understanding rippled outwards, influencing military doctrine for generations. Today, at the U.S. Army Intelligence Center of Excellence at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, the Line Cross Intercept is taught as a foundational case study in SIGINT hybrid operations. The lessons learned from Matsumoto and Finch directly influenced the creation of specialized teams embedding linguists with Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan after 2001 and Iraq after 2003, a direct lineage from the muddy listening posts of Leyte. Posthumous honors were finally paid to First Lieutenant David Cranston, with the Virginia Military Institute dedicating a new digital cartography lab in his name in 2008, a fitting tribute for the man who turned whispers into precise, mathematical destruction. If you visit Breakneck Ridge today, the jungle has reclaimed the scars, but local guides still find rusted 105mm shell fragments deep in the earth, silent, metallic proof of a secret war. The air, thick with the smell of wet earth and wild orchids, is profoundly quiet, the ghosts long since departed. The final tally of the team's impact remains staggering, a testament to the outsized power of ingenuity. Conservative analysis by Dr. James C. McNaughton and the U.S. Army Center of Military History estimates that the intelligence gathered by Matsumoto and Finch directly saved the lives of at least 650 American soldiers and prevented over 1,500 additional casualties. Their work is credited with shortening the brutal Leyte and Luzon campaigns by a combined total of nearly 7 weeks, an incalculable saving in blood and material. All of this was achieved not with a new bomb or a massive army, but with less than 20 pounds of standard-issue equipment, a lineman's handset, 2 alligator clips, and 300 yards of copper wire, wielded by 3 men who refused to accept an unwinnable situation. In the climate-controlled archives of the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, there sits a small, unassuming object, the original Sony TCD-5M cassette tape from Roy H. Matsumoto's interview on May 20, 1993. The brown magnetic ribbon, holding the calm, measured voice that once impersonated colonels and redirected artillery fire, is spooled silently within its plastic shell. It doesn't look like a weapon. It doesn't look like a key that unlocked a 50-year-old secret. But as it rests in the quiet darkness, it remains the ultimate symbol of the ghost in the wire, a voice captured, a history rewritten, and a silence finally, irrevocably broken.